in the interest and respect for everyone there, I thought we would start. So first of all, of course, thank you everyone for joining us today. And on behalf of Honest Reporting Canada, I'm Robert Walker. And again, thank you for joining our insider briefing. In fact, our last of 2020. As I mentioned, my name is Robert. I'm the Director of Community Relations for Honest Reporting Canada. Thank you for joining us. And of course, today we are very, very pleased to welcome Professor Gerald Steinberg of NGO Monitor. Professor Steinberg is founder and president of NGO Monitor and professor emeritus at Bar-Ilan University, where he founded the program on conflict management and negotiation. His research focuses on Middle East diplomacy and security, the politics of human rights and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and Israeli politics and arms control. He was awarded a prestigious Israel Science Foundation grant, was a member of the advisory board of the Israel Law Review, member of the Israel Council on Foreign Affairs, and a participating member of the Halifax International Security Forum, among many other related postings. For security considerations, of course, we can't answer questions during the webinar, but you'll see the Q&A button at the bottom of the toolbar there. Feel free to send me a note anytime. And at the end of the program, time permitting, we look forward to be posing audience questions to Professor Steinberg. So of course, now please welcome me in joining Professor Steinberg, and thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here, virtually at least.
So, well, first of all, tell us a little bit about, first of all, what's going on in Israel? I mean, every day there's a new government, every day there's a new threat of a new government. I know this isn't sort of necessarily what we want to get into, but just briefly, as somebody who's there, what in heaven's name is happening right now?
Well, we're going into lockdown, like I think it's also true in parts of Canada, and that's on everybody's mind. Everybody's concerned. At the same time, we're also revving up our the vaccination rate. I think we're the highest in the world per capita right now. Israelis are worried about that and trying to hope that things will be better in a few months. Elections are a little less, I think, less of concern because this is going to be our fourth election in 2 years. We know what to do. It'll be in 90 days from now, about I think March 23rd is maybe a little bit more than 90 days is the date that's scheduled. And it'll be a different kind of election. Probably the last three, with Netanyahu was basically running against Benny Gantz's party, former chief of staff, and he's probably out of politics now, Benny Gantz. It did not do well standing up against Netanyahu for the people who thought he would be an alternative. We'll have a different kind of politics, perhaps, at the end of this election, one that the range will be different. We'll see new leaders emerge. There are a lot of polls out there. I wouldn't trust any of them. It's life's interesting.
Do you think King Bibi is going to be reelected once again?
Well, Netanyahu's had led a coalition government on the third time, and it was almost 50-50 between what he could put together and what the opposition was able to put together. So he made a deal, but it wasn't really much of a coalition. He's in trouble. I think he recognizes that. But there's nobody out there that's a real visible alternative. There are people, two in particular, Gideon Sar, who split off from Likud, and also before that, Naftali Bennett, who had actually worked for Netanyahu maybe 10, 15 years ago, and now is head of a party. He calls itself Yamima, the right-wing party, Yamina. And but they're challenging Netanyahu. It'll take a while for them to build themselves up, see how well they do as potential leaders. If they don't, then Netanyahu may stay on.
Okay, well, thank you for that update. I mean, obviously every time we turn around, it seems to be another election in Israel, another threat of an election. So certainly we hope that the vaccination continues to work well, and that Israel can get back to relative normal as quickly as possible.
We're all hoping for that.
So, first, obviously, I'm well familiar with you. I've heard of you, and I've, been following your work for a long time. The first question I really wanted to ask is, help us understand a little bit how the depth of the problem that led you to creating an organization like NGO Monitor. I think when a lot of people think of the different challenges, facing Israel, I think there are many other, we think of campus, we think of media, we think of lawfare, I think we think of, many other, elements or fronts, but often NGOs is not something I think that many people think of. what sort of spurred you to recognize this was a problem that needed to be addressed?
Well, that was exactly the question I asked myself, or the issues that came up about 20 years ago. I teach international relations. I study international politics. I was doing Iran. I was doing other issues. I went to some conferences in Geneva that were not in the areas that were related to the areas I was working on. That was called arms control, security related issues. And this was about 20 years ago. It was around it was about 1999, 2000. And I saw there, as I saw in different places, but particularly in Geneva, the site of the second most important United Nations framework. It's also the site of the Human Rights Council. It's also the Conference on Disarmament, which is the event that I was involved with. But I saw that there were these booths. As you went into the UN chambers, you would pass booths of organizations that had pictures on them that showed suffering of Palestinians. It showed what they called Israeli war crimes. We're talking about 2000. We're talking about before we had Hamas in charge of Gaza. We're talking when Oslo was still theoretically functioning. Ehud Barak was the prime minister of Israel. It was a Labor Party-led government. They were negotiating what they claimed were looking towards. Just a minute here. Can you read? Let's see if that helps a bit. I'm not sure that's what the chat was that I was asked to do, but anyway, it was Labor Party was running Israel, was in charge. They just defeated Netanyahu, who was the prime minister from 96 through 98. So this was 99, and there were attempts to revive the Oslo process. And here were these 5 or 6 different booths next in the UN framework that everybody passed through that talked about and showed terrible pictures of Israeli war crimes, Palestinian victims, many of which were, I saw them clearly, they were posed, they were framed, they were artificial. These were propaganda, and people were taking them very seriously. And I asked, well, what are these people doing here? What are these organizations doing here? Oh, well, this is the United Nations, and we believe very strongly in civil society, and we think that these non-governmental organizations play an important role. And so any NGO that comes in, if they pass the appropriate standards, then we give them a place to present their case, their information, to hand out, to participate in the meetings. And I said, this is something strange. I've studied international politics by then it was already 20 years since I'd gotten my doctorate. And these were very small sort of fringe groups. The bottom line is that I saw this, and then we had this thing called the Durbin Conference. And there was an NGO forum there. And actually, Canada was a co-sponsor. This was in September of 2001.
This was the famous Durbin Conference you're talking about?
Famous or infamous Durbin Conference. And the main thing there was an NGO forum, 1,500 organizations, 5,000 or so delegates. And they were all focused on one issue, labeling Israel as an apartheid state. And the language they adopted was the complete international isolation of Israel. And this was supported by a vast majority. There was no real vote. It was by acclamation. Canada and the United Nations and the European Union together paid for this. Was a big, and the Ford Foundation. This cost tens of millions of dollars to stage and to bring all these people in. They were all paid for. And this was all about the power of the NGOs and their ability to play a major role in international politics. At the same time, the International Criminal Court was being set up, and they created an NGO format and forum to influence the International Criminal Court. And the first item on their agenda was taking Israelis before the International Court as war criminals. It was also the boycott movement began at the same time. Bottom line was, I put the pieces together and I said, these are powerful actors. You know, I was in Canada during the summer just before, and then I followed it afterwards. And I saw you're in Honest Reporting. So I saw the Globe and Mail gave this Durbin Conference and this NGO forum a major play in their newspaper. This was before we had a lot of social media. People were still reading the newspapers, the mainstream papers. I think it was probably also on the CBC. That this was taken very seriously as a major pronouncement, that these organizations had decided that Israel was a country based on apartheid and war crimes, ethnic cleansing, even genocide. So the bottom line was that I saw this as an important part of international politics that wasn't being properly addressed. In fact, I came back to Israel, and there were no Israelis, nobody in the foreign ministry was even looking at non-governmental organizations. They all said, we don't deal with NGOs, we deal with governments. NGOs are not important. So I said I was going to do 2 or 3 years. We're talking about 2001. I was going to do a project. I was going to write about the political power of NGOs, and in particular how they are leading the demonization of Israel. We didn't use that term. We called it soft power warfare. And I wrote a couple of pieces, and then the problem just got worse. You know, it's like doing an archaeological dig. You take away a top layer, and then you see another layer and another layer. So I began to look at a few of the most powerful organizations that I saw in the United Nations and that I saw in Durbin, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. Then I saw that there were another dozen organizations that were somewhat similar around the world. Then I realized there was a whole layer of Palestinian groups, and then there was a layer of Israeli groups, and this was a huge business. It was tens of millions of dollars, now hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Then it was less. And then again, it was Canada that was paying for this, and it was the European Union. They got a lot of money from private foundations. I spent some time talking to people in the Ford Foundation. Why are you sponsoring this kind of hatred? And that developed into NGO Monitor. And now we're 20 years later, 19 years later, and it's something that I'm doing. We now have 20 employees at NGO Monitor, and the research keeps becoming more and more revealing. And I'll talk about that later also, the fact that, for instance, we found out that a major component of this NGO network, this international NGO network, has close links to terrorist organizations. Why didn't anybody find that out before? Because they didn't do the research. We're a research organization. We make the information public, and then we confront the people who are enabling these organizations with this information. I'll just add one other point, because this goes back to 2000, 2001. There were good organizations. Honest Reporting deals with the media. UN Watch deals with the United Nations. There were different aspects. There were campus groups that dealt with anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli propaganda and campaigns on university campuses. What I saw was that the NGO world was, just as you described it, it was kind of a black hole, and it needed to be addressed because it was an engine that was driving this whole process: the money, the access, the political power, the influence on the media. So that's a long answer, but I think it's important to provide that background.
So help us understand. Well, thank you for that. Help us understand, the kinds of these, these actors, that you're talking about, the kind of NGOs that you've monitored over the last, 2 decades. What are some of the kinds of work that these NGOs do? I mean, are these NGOs that, claim to be human rights organizations and go to the Palestinian territories and distribute hate literature? I mean, because when we think NGO, for those of us who are sort of lay people not in your expertise, that's a massive field. What kind of work, in your experience, are these NGOs, claiming to do, and what are they in practice doing?
I'll give you a couple of examples. In 2008, the end of 2008, 2009, we had the first of a series of small wars between Israel and Hamas. Hamas attacked Israeli towns near the border. Israel responded. And as soon as Israel responds to attacks, the entire NGO network goes into action. Human Rights Watch, which is one of and Amnesty, I'll do both of them together, the two most powerful, influential organizations in this field, immediately issue condemnations. And they use the same language we heard in Durbin: war crimes, genocide, violation of international humanitarian law, use of illegal weapons, all sorts of other things. And they take these reports. First of all, as you know, the mainstream media eats them up. You'll find dozens of journalists who don't even bother to ask, is this accurate? Is it in any way balanced, or does it explain the reality? They don't ask those questions. It's a very tight relationship. These are their friends. They got drinking with them in the bars. They have, some of them had similar experiences working, journalists who work with NGOs, NGOs who work with the media platforms. So it immediately becomes very often a front page story. The accusation, Human Rights Watch accuses Israel of war crimes, is a front page story. across the mainstream media. And back then, and I talked about in 2008, 2009, the Gaza war. You go back to Lebanon in 2006, and I was in Japan. I went to Japan afterwards for a conference, and I had the Japanese papers, the English language ones that I could read, but also the Japanese ones that some people showed me, had front page stories quoting Human Rights Watch and Amnesty about the terrible things Israel was doing. That's a drop in the bucket. You get this one time after another, after every incident that happens, whether it's in Lebanon or in Gaza or any place else. They're campaigners. They claim to do research, but in fact, what they do is they do propaganda. We've caught them many, many times, straight out lying, dishonest, claiming, for instance, that Israel killed, let's say, well, we had the example in Jenin in 2002, the Jenin massacre myth. Israel killed hundreds of Palestinians. Civilians, deliberately. We hear that almost every language repeats itself over and over and over again. And they put out that propaganda, which then becomes the basis, it's the foundations for what you see in the media, then goes to the United Nations. The United Nations issues a condemnation. Human Rights Council forms an investigatory commission, which then quotes from the same NGOs. And that's how the process goes on. And it influences politicians. I frequently hear politicians, very often including in Canada, who will mouth the things that they hear from NGOs that they may have seen in the mainstream media, or they picked it, or they heard it from a UN official, and they repeat it and straight from the same sources with the same problem. So it is a serious part of the process. I argue that in many ways they lead it, and it needs to be confronted.
So, so these NGOs, I mean, you mentioned a couple, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. I mean, I know there are so many smaller organizations, NGOs out there that you track. Where do they fit into this, and sort of what's the role that they play?
Well, there are different layers. And I talked about the global ones because their budgets are the largest and they have the greatest influence. But in many ways, they have a number of subcontractors or smaller groups. In many cases, they may have one or two people on their payroll on the ground here. They may not, but they very often will cut and paste from Palestinian groups, from Israeli groups. Also, when you put all these smaller groups together, they form a very large mass. For instance, the United Church of Canada does its campaigns on Israel, adopts resolutions, then they will often quote, not necessarily from Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, they might quote from a Palestinian organization, Al-Haq, Adamir, Al-Mazan, many Palestinian groups like that that are out there that make their information not just available, but they actively push it. So they provide another layer. If you're a group that wants to show your sympathies are with the Palestinians and you want to attack Israel for being the same language, aggressive violation of international law, apartheid, very often, if you're a church group, you'll pick a Palestinian organization, or even better, one of the Israeli groups. They all work together. We very often will see joint statements. Sometimes somebody who's had enough of this will come back and write a piece about how these organizations all strategize before they appear, whether it's in a parliamentary discussion in Canada or the United States in the Congress or in Europe or before the UN Human Rights Council. So there are different layers, and the pieces basically form a large mass together. Slightly different functions, slightly different forms of credibility, but all adding up to the basic same message.
Right. So, I'm curious because you mentioned something about, the NGOs that have a presence in Israel. I was looking at the list of NGOs that you monitor on your website, and it's, a lot longer than I would have, even anticipated. And I was sort of struck by two things. One is, I'll ask the first part, which is how many are in Israel? Um, what what do we make of that, and what are the successive Israeli governments? It changes daily, but what are successive Israeli governments' views on these? Do they see these as, well, this is part of a free democracy and this is just the consequence of it, or are they monitored by the Israeli government? What do we make of that?
I told you that back in 2001, around the time of Durbin, there was nobody in the Israeli government who even recognized NGOs as a problem. It took till the Goldstone report till 2009, and the threat that Israelis really would be dragged before the International Criminal Court by these as a bait on the basis of these NGO claims, or that the boycott, the BDS movement would start to have some teeth. The Israeli government then began to look at these issues. We're talking about, as I said, 2009, 2010, but they really didn't know how to deal with it. Governments, we got, on the one hand, we have non-governmental organizations, and then we have governments. When you're at the receiving end of an NGO attack, and Israel is the prime target, it's very difficult for governments to deal with that. They don't really know how. They don't have the training or the framework to do that. I think that's one of the reasons NGO Monitor has established a very strong niche, because we don't have, I'd say we have the kind of types of skills that are different than what governments have. If we do research, governments generally don't do research. They've tried on occasion, but it doesn't fit in very well. So I'd say the awareness of the problem grew. At the same time, as you said, there are very strong tendencies to say, and there are pressures also, not just tendencies, but pressures. When the Israeli government began to try to at least provide more transparency, who are the NGOs that are active? Where does their money come from? And what are the options to respond to them? They were attacked, these Israeli government officials were attacked by European officials, and of course by the NGOs, for interfering with civil society, for closing the space of civil society activity. And civil society, as everybody says, is essential for democracy. Now, one of the questions that comes up is, when we talk about civil society, what's the basis for their legitimacy? Who decides that we're going to invite, so that the United Nations is going to invite an Israeli group called Breaking the Silence, a Palestinian group called Al-Haq, and maybe Human Rights Watch, to present their findings on a particular incident before a UN body, Human Rights Council, or sometimes it might be a parliamentary group in one of the democratic countries. None of these people are elected. There's no process of checks and balances. So out of hundreds of organizations that exist in Israel that have some connection with human rights, that claim to promote human rights, why are the same 5 or 6 always being chosen? And that's an important question. The Israeli government really didn't have a way of dealing with that. It's one that needs to be raised in many different frameworks. That the myths that surround what we call the halo effect, that NGOs or civil society organizations are somehow sacrosanct, that you're not allowed to criticize them, is something that's very strong, and it's one of the basis for attacking NGO Monitor. How dare you criticize these organizations? Well, we're also an NGO. By the way, NGO Monitor is recognized by the United Nations ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council. Out of about 500 organizations, we managed to get their imprimatur as well, so we can participate in the same discussions. You need to have checks and balances. You need to have criticism of these same NGOs and the relationship with governments. So I think the Israeli government, different officials under different times, couldn't figure out the best way to deal with this. I will point out that Mr. Netanyahu has been our prime minister since 2009. And at various times, he has challenged the dominant position of a certain group of these groups of NGOs. And in fact, one of the things we haven't talked about yet, but who's funding them? Because that's how they get their power. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
So these NGOs are typically, I mean, you mentioned the Ford Foundation. For most of these NGOs that you're monitoring, are they primarily funded by sort of Western governments, Canada, the EU, the States, etc., or is it private foundations, private philanthropists? I mean, what's the breakdown?
For Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, most of the money is private. Amnesty gets some government money. Human Rights Watch apparently gets very little, their funders are hidden. But for all the others, I think we monitor about 250 organizations. I haven't counted them recently. So if you went through the list, you were busy. So there are another, let's say 230 of those, let's say 50 Israeli groups, maybe 50 Palestinian groups in that package. Those are almost all funded by foreign governments. They're not really NGOs. They're what we call gongos or fongos, foreign or government funded NGOs or foreign government funded NGOs. And they're subcontractors for government policy. The Europeans are the most dominant source of that funding. Tens of millions, about 110 million is what we calculate in euros. That's what, about 130, 135 million Canadian dollars every year goes to, let's say, about 80 to 90 Israeli and Palestinian NGOs, all on one political position. They're all in a very narrow range. In the Israeli case, in the Israeli democratic spectrum, in the Palestinian range, there is no range. They all do the Palestinian party line. And year after year, they get money from European governments and under liberal governments, also from the Canadian government. And that's a major source of their power. We can see what happens, for instance, if you have a small group that just gets off the ground and manages to get $1 million or sometimes $5 million from different government funders. Within a couple of months, you're going to start seeing op-ed articles in mainstream media. You're going to start seeing videos. You're going to start seeing interviews with top line journalists. You're going to see them flying around the world, less so now, but zooming around the world, speaking in United Nations framework because they got money. And they crowd out the sphere of the universe of NGOs that are not radical, dedicated to propaganda against Israel. So the money is a very important factor.
And so what are these governments, what is their goal with this? Is this to sort of echo their own views but make it seem legitimate? Like, hey, we're not saying this, the locals are saying. Like, why are they giving money? To what end? What are their deliverables and outcomes that they're seeking to achieve?
I think there are 2 or 3 different ones that are going on in parallel. And one of the issues is that these were ideas that were formulated 20 years ago and really haven't been challenged since then. First of all, about 80% of this money comes from Western European governments, and they more or less follow the leader. They saw this as a means of being influential when the relationship with Israel is very problematic, and where Palestinians, they thought this was a means of promoting the Palestinian cause and what they called a Palestinian state and a two-state solution and human rights, which means weakening Israel on these fronts. They don't, so most of the European governments say, we don't support BDS, but we don't mind if the organizations we fund are involved in BDS. Well, that means you're supporting BDS. The German parliament last year adopted a resolution saying that we won't support BDS, and yet there a lot of money still goes from the German government through dozens of different frameworks to some of the most active BDS supporters, and it goes from Europe. The money goes to Palestinian groups, it goes to Israeli groups, it goes to European groups, and then you'll find them in Canada or the United States on college campuses with that money promoting their agendas and biases. They'll promote the BDS resolutions on campuses, or Israel Apartheid Week. The speakers will find were funded by the same organizations, meaning they were funded by governments. All these are part of the multiple layers that I described. This is a way for the funder governments, for the primary ones. I'll talk about Canada in a minute. If you're going to ask me about Canada, should I preempt and give you my answer?
I will ask you about Canada, but please preempt away.
Okay, so I'll finish. This was really a European concept, that they would fund these organizations. And it's not only Israelis and Palestinian groups. They operate around the world. They've gotten themselves in trouble. But if you look at how they spread out the money, and this is research that we did that the Europeans really didn't like, and they didn't do it. If they did it, they didn't publish it on their own. You see a very big spike when its money goes to Israeli and Palestinian groups. Over half of the money that they spend promoting democracy and human rights in the Middle East, where there's not a whole lot of democracy and human rights, through NGOs, goes to Israeli, these 80 or so or 90 Israeli and Palestinian groups. I said about 110 million euros a year, and that's probably about, on an average year, half or even more than half of all the money allocated to NGOs by Europe in the Middle East. So not to Syrian groups. Well, we don't have many Syrian NGOs. They'll say Iraq, Iran, very little. But when you look at Israeli and Palestinian activities, and by the way, the Palestinians and the Israeli groups have been very good at milking the system, at telling the Europeans exactly what they want to hear in their applications, and then in their claims of this is what we accomplished. Oh, we had 10,000 people at one of our events. We had this outreach and that impact. And the Europeans say, very nice, put a rubber stamp on it, give them money the next year. And that's how the game works. And as I said, it's a lot of money involved and a lot of political influence. And it has some very negative impacts.
Right. So, I mean, as you mentioned, you discussed sort of, the European view to this. Here in Canada, you've also mentioned, of course, that successive, primarily liberal governments, as you said, have funded a lot of these NGOs. What is their? I'm trying to how to articulate this. Would you characterize them more as sort of having an agenda, as you described the Europeans as having, or are they almost kind of? Would we describe them as a friar? Right? They're sort of, picked up in the nice words of we're promoting democracy, and they're just sort of not necessarily cognizant of the deleterious impact that this funding is having.
I've had a lot of in-depth conversations, meetings with Canadian officials for, I guess, about 40 years or so, at least 20 years on these issues. And I wouldn't use the term friar, but I think there are a couple of factors. First of all, there's obviously a big difference between the liberal approach to this and the conservative, the Tory approach to this. When Harper came in and Baird, they cut off most of the funding. They understood that their money was not being used to support agendas that were consistent with Canadian foreign policy. Liberals take a liberal perspective, that they argue that non-governmental organizations or civil society organizations are an important part of liberal democracy. And just as Europeans are supporting these organizations, we should too. I think there's a certain amount of follow the leader here. And that's an issue that I've had some disagreements with Canadian officials about. About a year after the Trudeau government went into office, it took a year, they made their first funding for a Palestinian NGO. And at the time, the foreign minister at the time, Christina Freeland, was here. And I was also in Ottawa and had some meetings with her and her staff. And then she was here, and a couple of us from NGO Monitor met with her during the time that she was here, and also members of her staff in global affairs. And we tried to get an understanding of why they decided to do this. They said, look, we saw this, our agenda, the first funding was a $5 million grant this is the first renewal of funding to any Palestinian group, of which 1 million was for women's empowerment. That's a very strong liberal agenda item. Women's empowerment around the world, women's empowerment in societies, and they chose 5 different places, $1 million each. It was run through the United Church of Canada and something called Kairos Canada, which have a history of being very active.
I was going to ask you about them.
Yeah. Sorry? I
was going to ask you about them, but yeah.
Okay, well, the million that they gave to a Palestinian group went to a women's group called WEAM, Women's Empowerment. That is consistent with the liberal agenda, but apparently they were not aware of the fact, they said they weren't aware, that this WEAM group is also very active in BDS. We pointed that out, we researched it, we documented it in detail. It was raised in Parliament by a number of people, including Linda Frum raised it, but it was also discussed by members of the Liberal Party, and it was uncomfortable to raise these issues of why and what kind of vetting was done. And what they did was they said, okay, we will make sure that our money is not used for BDS. That money is fungible. It goes anywhere, and it's very hard to be able to do that. I won't say it's impossible, but I would question that. I think they were not aware. The reason I'm telling this story is my impression is that the top people were not aware of where their money was going. And there's an excuse for that. If you're running a large global affairs budget, I don't know what the budget is, and you're starting to get into different areas and you subcontract the decisions to organizations that are seen to do good things around the world, United Church of Canada, you're not going to look at the specifics of who exactly in each country gets the money. And that's where NGO Monitor plays a role. We can provide that information. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody at a much lower level in the hierarchy was aware of these issues and thought that was something that was important to do, as happens in Europe. Another part of this is that it's part of a global network, and I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but the people who work on these issues in the Canadian government, and now it's been reestablished as part of the seat of the Canadian International Development Agency, has its counterparts in Sweden and Switzerland and Germany and across Europe. And of course, they get together and they talk and they exchange ideas. So Canada's part of that network. And I would argue that they didn't ask enough questions, and it can be embarrassing. And that's where we come in. I will say that in many of the conversations I've had with Canadian officials, the usual response is, I'm not aware of the details, I have to get back to you. That's also in writing. We will look into it. There's another aspect that I'd like to raise, just I don't want to run out of time, so I'm going to raise it. WEAM and this United Church of Canada funding is the first direct Canadian re-involvement in funding NGOs. The second one was an organization called Man Development, which I think is somewhat similar in terms of not really following who was involved. And in that case, some of the people at Man Development have links to the Popular Front of Liberation of Palestine, a terror organization. And when we showed the links, it raised some discomfort. But the largest amount of Canadian aid money for this region and maybe around the world goes through the United Nations. Canada provides large amounts every year to UN bodies. That is also a very fundamental plank of the liberal approach to international affairs. They have, one of the first things they did was they reinstated funding to Unra. Now, as in conversations that I and other people had, we asked the question, and it's come up also with Bob Ray, and I would say the answers are not satisfactory. It's been now since 1949, so we're over 71 years since UNRWA was created. There are no Palestinian refugees, very few, and they're in their 80s anyway from the war, and the whole concept is ridiculous, and it's counterproductive. But that's what other countries are doing. They don't quite put it that way. It's part of our international duty. Same thing with, we give money to UNICEF Palestine.
Right.
UNICEF Palestine then gives a lot of that money to these NGOs that are, one of them is Save the Children. It's ostensibly the money is for neonatal care in Gaza. That's an absolutely appropriate cause, but I said ostensibly. The next layer, the due diligence layer, is to say, what is really done with that money? And that's where governments generally fail. And that's where I think the Canadian government needs to put a lot more resources. What is actually being done with our money? When a group of researchers in Jerusalem knows more about where Canadian money given to the United Nations ends up than the people in Ottawa, that should raise some red flags. And it happens time after time. Right. So when these UN bodies are putting money into NGOs that are promoting the same kind of hate campaigns that we talked about previously, then that's something the Canadian government is not getting its money's worth for.
Right. And now I wonder, in terms of sort of the feedback or how the Canadian government, in your experience, both sort of whittles down or determines the appropriate recipients for this, and how they sort of measure the response. The reason I was going to mention Kairos, but I remember when the Harper government cut funding, there was a large media uproar, of course. And I'm sort of wondering aloud, I fear I know the answer, is that I wonder how much successive Canadian governments sort of look at the media and don't just look at this as a development, but look at this as sort of nice PR, to say that the government is investing, XYZ in foreign development, and they look at the sort of fawning media coverage. Is that an accurate statement?
I think it's very accurate. I wouldn't say that's the only factor. There are other things that are driving this, but certainly getting sometimes called virtue signaling, getting virtue signaling points. is something that is very much part of the process. And it's not just in Canada. Again, I've seen Norwegian foreign ministers wanting to have their pictures taken, and in fact, in one case, being disappointed because it was not easy to do. I want to show the people who support me back home for my next election campaign the wonderful things I'm doing with their money. Let's get the Israeli and Palestinian groups together for a photo shot that we support. And at that time, the Norwegian minister was upset because the Palestinians wouldn't come for a photo shot with the Israelis. But it's very much an issue of photo ops and virtue signaling, and being able to say we're doing the right thing, like the other wonderful countries, like Sweden and Norway and other countries. What we get out of this, I often ask the question, what tangible positive results have been achieved? And I think the same thing can be asked when the end of this women's empowerment project is. Again, most governments, including the Canadian government, don't have an office that is, or I was going to say an individual, but you need more than one person assessing what you got for your money. So what do? They take the report. They're going to get a report from the United Church of Canada and Kairos. And that report will have basically the report that they got from WEAM, which was contracted out to somebody to write for them. It says, these are the wonderful things we did with your money. This is what we said we were going to do. This is what we did. And they're going to say, see, that's a great success. Does it really show any more women's empowerment in Palestinian Authority? Probably not. Does it show that all the money that was used for propaganda and BDS? Almost definitely not. That's how the pattern works. It is depressing that after 20 years or so doing this, it hasn't really changed fundamentally. But I do want to say a couple of optimistic aspects of this. In Canada, there's clearly an awareness that if they don't do the due diligence on NGO funding, they're going to be found out, and it's going to be embarrassing in Parliament and at least in parts of the media. So I think we have slowed down the process. There'd be a lot more examples of this out there than there are now. We're already in year five of a Liberal government. There's still relatively very little money. I'm not saying that the money that's out there is being well spent, but it's very low level. And I believe the issue of tracking where your UN donations go has now filtered into the global affairs. I see that more and more, an awareness that if it will be tracked and it will be published, and NGO Monitor will put it out there, and it's better that they know about it in advance and make sure it isn't misspent. So there is some movement in the right direction on this. Some of the stuff comes from very strange, not strange places, it's politics. The United Church of Canada funding began because a member of Parliament, this is what we understand, had close connections with the United Church of Canada, and it was part of his both constituency impact, but also his own internal sense of what he wants to do in Parliament that drove that $5 million grant. And when you have an influential member of your party or the government party that thinks this is important and is very committed to that agenda and has or is influenced by the people who benefit from it, then usually there's very little pushback from anybody in the government. Let's just do it. So that's not a matter strictly of media encouragement as it is domestic politics. And that's an important part of it.
Okay, so when you mentioned, you mentioned the United Church of Canada a few times. When these conversations happen, I mean, here in Canada, of course, perhaps this is outside your wheelhouse, or perhaps not. It seems like in Canada, for a tax receivable organization, they can't be involved in the political sphere in this kind of sense. Is this, to the best of your knowledge, a problem for organizations like the United Church, or are they sort of skirting the issues in that respect?
I think in these aspects, this is not a major issue. I don't remember the CRA, the Canada Revenue rules, but I believe they're similar to other countries, that when they say politics, they mean politics in Canada. And when you say you're supporting women's empowerment in countries where women are oppressed, they would say in the Palestinian case, because of the Israeli occupation, it's always the Israeli occupation. It's never a local problem. It's never the society. But whatever it is, that's not politics. That's doing good deeds. That's human rights. It's supporting liberal principles or humanitarian principles or international law, all of those things. So I don't think that is a revenue issue or a CRA issue. I think it's much more an issue of due diligence and being responsible. Are you wasting Canadian taxpayers' money? Now, if the United Church of Canada was funding organizations that were not involved in these kinds of campaigns, it would be very different. But that's also part of their agenda. There are good humanitarian aid organizations around the world and also in Canada that are not involved in promoting demonization of Israel. But that is not the way that these decisions were made.
Right. So we're talking about, we talked about, the United Church and some others. What are some of the, your wall of shame of sort of some of the Canadian NGOs that are supported that perhaps we would never hear of? We've heard of United Church in the media, and Kairos in the media. What are some others that perhaps are below the surface that are just, quite problematic?
I'd say in Canada, if you're asking about Canada, there's not very much. The government is not involved in funding some of the problematic groups. Now, you all know about Amnesty International and Amnesty Canada. Amnesty Canada has been out front very often over the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years in promoting the demonization of Israel, all the things we're talking about. They recently had a change of leadership. There is some hope that the new head of Amnesty Canada will be less ideologically radical, less innately hostile towards Israel. Some people did see Amnesty Canada under the previous leadership as having an anti-Semitic layer of being singling out Israel, targeting Israel, partly because that's what all of Amnesty does, but partly, again, the Canadian branch was also quite active in that. So Human Rights Watch is an American organization, has a pretty strong following and raises money in Toronto. And they are also very much involved in the isolation of Israel and promoting boycotts through the United Nations. They're way overboard, I would say, often obsessive, the leadership of Human Rights Watch in their attacks on Israel. It's been like that for 20 years. These are people who are not subject to any kind of internal democratic process. They're not held accountable. So the leadership of Human Rights Watch has not changed at all. Ken Roth, I believe, as of last year at least, came to Toronto once a year. They had a big gala and made a lot of money and a lot of publicity. And they're very active in targeting Israel, as I said, in condemning Israel. So the Canadian situation is somewhat different. Each country is different. And I think that there's still, to some degree, some caution about how far the government wants to go. But when you have a society that still believes that blindly that groups that use the terms like human rights or promote peace between, which is a wonderful idea, but don't look at the details and are willing to accept and repeat and buy into the slogans and the myths, then you have a problem. I think the issue of accepting the versions that are put out by NGOs in the media, in the Canadian mainstream media, is still a very serious issue. And in fact, we have a lot of correspondence or exchanges with Honest Reporting in Canada about when we see that some media outlet is quoting one of these major NGOs in an attack on Israel. We'll often provide the details. What's wrong with this claim that now has been put into the Globe and Mail? Again, it's less than it was 10 years ago, a lot less, but still gets out there, or is on the CBC or on some other mainstream framework.
Right. So this is an interesting sort of line in terms of, what you're doing with this information. So we have a question here from the audience that basically asks, has NGO Monitor, have you communicated directly with the Office of the Canadian Auditor General about how Canadian government funds are being spent in terms of, sort of putting this information out? And you mentioned some of the meetings you've had. Is that something that you've done as well with the Auditor General?
I'm not aware of that. We do have people who run the Canadian desk and do some issues that I may not be aware of. I may not remember. I don't remember that. We frequently, when we write our reports, we certainly we have questions that we ask queries or freedom of information requests, those will go to global affairs. Those may go to the Prime Minister's office, may go to the Privy Council, and then members of Parliament. That's the spectrum of official Canadian contacts that we have. I have to think about whether the Auditor General route might be useful, and whether they might be able to accomplish more than what members of Parliament do. It really, one of the things that I've learned about NGO research and reporting is that it's really a very specialized niche area. I will tell you that we do have, I'll answer a question by a different, or I'll give you a response on a different area. We have had, the last couple of years, a lot of back and forth with the European Union's parallel, the auditing department there, with a lot more money involved and a lot more questions about whether anybody's following where it goes. So it's something that maybe we would consider to go further than that. And it's also something that members of Parliament or members of the public can certainly take our information and raise the question. I guess also it'd be good to have a Canadian citizen do that, more than some. We're conscious of the fact that we're an Israeli group. We have had a Canadian work doing our research. She now works for Michal Kotler-Wunsch in the Knesset. But she was our Canadian researcher and had good contacts. So something we can consider.
So, another question we have here is, you mentioned that things have changed over the last decade. You mentioned some of the media coverage in the Globe Mail, et cetera. Is that more a function of 10 or 15 years ago, there was sort of open conflict between Israel and Hamas, and rockets and suicide bombings, et cetera, or are there other factors at play here?
I think, first of all, as you know, you do honest reporting, so that the media has changed. It's changed quite a bit. And I think that the ability to just cut and paste from NGO reports, whether it's on Israel or any other places, they're going to get challenged. You got a lot more reliance on social media. So maybe there is more caution or a different kind of agenda. I think you're also right that it's not something that's major issue in the news these days. We've had the last major clash was what was called the Gaza war clashes, the Gaza fence clashes that took place probably 2 or 3 years ago. As soon as something comes up, it comes back into the media again. So I think that may be another factor. But
Right.
the broad spectrum of media coverage now is very different. Back in 10, 15 years ago, there were only 3 or 4 major national media outlets. National Post maybe was just starting out, but you really only had the Globe and Mail, you had the local papers, you had the Toronto Star, and then, at least from where I sat anyway, you had the Ottawa Citizen, you had the smaller papers, but it's quite different now.
So, in terms of on a macro sense, sort of, from the audience as well, we have, this increasing number of, Arab and Islamic countries who are signing peace treaties with Israel. You have this unusual situation where you've got the, European Union or European countries who are funding more anti-Israel NGOs than, the Muslim or Islamic Arab countries have. We talked about the EU, we talked about, Canada. What about some of these, Arab or other Middle Eastern countries? Have they been funding historically? Have they been funders of these Israeli or Palestinian, anti-Israel NGOs as well?
It's interesting that when, again, I'm going back 15 years or more, the assumption was that these were all being funded by the Gulf countries, by Saudi Arabia, by Iran. And we found very little evidence of that. And we see, why would all these organizations, Palestinian groups particularly, go knocking at the doors of Europeans if they had access to millions and millions of Arab oil money? One of the interesting things is that, which we didn't talk about, but I have to put it in here, there are about a dozen major Palestinian NGOs with using language of human rights, like the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. They're actually in different forms, as I said, about a dozen of these. They are all linked in different ways to a terrorist organization called the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, PFLP. They've been getting most of their budgets for 20 years from European governments who didn't at all, they claim, see any kind of connection with terrorism. the PFLP. It wasn't until we did the research, and I have to say, it took me 10 years to be able to put the pieces together. It was about 2015 that we began to see this pattern growing. Last year, a couple months ago, the Minister of International Aid in the Netherlands got up in front of Parliament in response to questions. You can guess where the questions came from. Said, is it true that our money went to pay for the killer of Rina Schnurb in August 2019? The PFLP did a terror attack which was aimed at an Israeli family that was hiking, and the 17-year-old girl was killed. The father and the son were injured. And she said, we have reason to believe that our funding, that we paid for their salaries, because she didn't say this, but as we showed, the same people who ran these NGOs, or in this case, it was the guy who was the head of the finances and accounting for one of these major NGOs, was also a commander of a PFLP squad. And we, just by looking at information that's out there, social media, and comparing pictures and names, we were able to show it's the same people. She suspended the funding, and she was super embarrassed, and has taken steps because of the embarrassment to avoid similar situations in the future. Now, that just shows you that this has been undocumented for many, many years. If they had money from Arab states, they wouldn't even bother going to the Europeans. And maybe the Arab country, look, for the Arab countries, organizations that say they're promoting human rights, first of all, they're Palestinian groups. And as we now have seen, a lot of the countries have had enough of the Palestinian issue. But I think it's more than that also. These groups that are part of this network could actually be problematic for the regimes that they're independent sources of power. We don't want them. We don't want them in Kuwait. We don't want them in Saudi Arabia. We don't want them in Egypt. We don't want them in Syria. Let them all do Israel stuff. That's fine. Let them do Palestine-Israel stuff. And that's how the pattern works. So with a couple of exceptions and relatively minor, it's not that the money comes from Western countries. This is a Western liberal, and I don't mean that in the sense of Canadian politics or anybody else's politics, progressive concept that funding NGOs to do human rights and to do peace and to international development is a marvelous idea that can only do good. And unfortunately, it's become so deeply embedded that the counter aspects of the counterproductive aspects of this, and I use that term carefully, the role that they play in promoting hate and conflict and violence. And I give you the example again. It's so important to understand that millions of dollars and euros and krona and other things are going into organizations that are essentially part of a terrorist network, without Palestinian terrorist network. So that shows you how cynical the NGO world can be.
So just briefly, in terms of the connections to PFLP and other organizations, what percentage would you say of the 250 organizations that you're sort of monitoring, are sort of specifically in bed with terrorist organizations and funding them and sort of otherwise inexorably tied, versus just sort of promoting BDS, etc.? I mean, what would you say is the breakdown?
The way you ask the question, I'm hesitant to answer it. The breakdown is, we're talking about 10 to 12 organizations, depending on exactly how you define. Let's say 12. That's a small percentage, right? That's whatever it is, 5% of the total. But they're very influential. They have a lot of money. They, in many ways, influence another 50 or so, 40 or so Palestinian groups. It's the party line. And then they're picked up by Israeli groups. They're allies with. They sign joint letters. They appear together in United Nations Forum. They appear together in front of members of parliament and Congress. So I would say that out of the 250, well, some of them are board members. One of them is the head of one of the Palestinian groups is a board member of Human Rights Watch, just as an example. There are Amnesty connections as well. So it is a phenomenon that has penetrated very broadly that entire NGO network. And they are also very involved in BDS. I'll just add that PFLP is a terrorist organization, but it's also even more radical against Israel, against peace than the PLO is. They're actually than Fatah. They're part of the PLO. PFLP is part of the PLO, but they are critical of Fatah. They're also not Hamas, they're not Islamic fundamentally. Some of them actually had Christian connections, which is why they were able to make those connections in Europe. They are not, they are opposed to negotiation with Israel, compromise with Israel. They have 1948 agenda, get rid of Israel.
Right.
And yet these are considered to be human rights organizations. That shows you the complete disconnect between what the governments say they're funding and what the reality is.
Right, absolutely. Well, listen, this time has flown by. I mean, certainly we could ask you a great deal more. This has certainly been fascinating for me. Just the final question is, how can people find or follow more of your work with NGO Watch?
NGO
NGO
Monitor.
Monitor, excuse me, pardon me.
NGO, the read, there's a historic reason why we're not NGO Watch. Basically, it was copyrighted. Nobody uses it. NGO Monitor, you just Google us, ngo-monitor.org if you want, but you can find us where we're out there. We have a website. We work with a lot of Canadian organizations, including Honest Reporting, and we're happy to talk, to provide information, and any questions anybody has, we're happy to respond.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Professor Steinberg, for joining us and sharing your
Thank you for giving us the
with NGO
platform.
Monitor. Thank you again, everyone, for joining our Honest Reporting Canada Insider Briefing with Professor Gerald Steinberg. This recording will be posted on the YouTube channel in the coming days. And stay tuned for our next Insider Briefing on January 17th. We're fortunate to have booked famed Israeli author and commentator Yossi Klein Halevi. So again, thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Professor, for joining us as well. And stay tuned for the recording. All the best.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.